Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here. It's exactly 16:30 South African Standard Time. I'm sure there are a number of others that will be joining us, but in the interest of time, I think it's good that we start. It's a pleasure to have all of you here. I recognize a number of names on the program. We're just short of 45 days, actually, to reach a one-year mark since we had the first Ivan Rugema Memorial Lecture last year on November 19. Those of you who were here, you would remember we had a very excellent occasion, very intellectually stimulating, but also in a very fundamental way, honoring our good friend, sibling, lecturer, colleague, and so forth, the late Ivan Rugema. We had a number of speakers, including from on behalf of the family. His father, Mr. Michael Rugema, spoke, you'd recall, Lisa Draga, Zain Satardin, but also Professor Sloos Nielsen, under whom Ivan served. We also had the pleasure of having Professor Uphoff speak, because he's known Ivan for a number of years. Professor Patricia Lenahan moderated the session, and of course we had an excellent lecture by Justice Sam Rujeje, the former Chief Justice of Rwanda and former Professor of Law here at the University of the Western Cape, and the title was Traditional and Modern Dispute Resolution Mechanisms and Their Impact on Contemporary Rwanda. And of course, Professor Labak did the closing for us. So it's a pleasure to be back here to do the second, Ivan Rugema Memorial Lecture. We once again have a very rich program. Without taking much time, let me just say a few words about the ground rules, and I will hand over to the Dean to do the opening and welcome remarks for us. Just in terms of the ground rules, for the speakers that are already on the panelist list, please keep your cameras on, at least when you are invited to speak. That would be very much appreciated. But of course, if the connection is not that great and if it is interrupted, then I think you should feel free to put your camera off. I have been informed that those that are on the attendees list will not be able to put their mics on, but as you will see from the program, there is a question and answer session once Professor Uphoff has delivered the memorial lecture for us. As he is busy delivering the lecture, please feel free to put your comments in the chat. When the opportunity for the question and answer comes, then I will try to collect those and bring them forward. Comments, questions, and I'll bring them forward to Professor Uphoff. One last point, this event is being recorded. We've already started recording 3 minutes ago at 16:30. So thank you very much. Without any further ado, I hand over to Professor Jacques Deville, the Dean of the Faculty of Law here at the University of the Western Cape. Over to you, Dean.
Thank you very much, Professor Mesmer. The Deputy Vice Chancellor, Research and Innovation, Professor Franz, is here today. Professor Uphoff, family and friends of Ivan Rugema, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and I see that we're also joined by our keynote speaker of last year, as Professor Mesmer mentioned, the former Chief Justice of Rwanda and our former colleague, Sam Rujeje. Welcome to all of you to the second Ivan Rugema Memorial Lecture. It is similar to last year, a sad, but at the same time, a joyous occasion. We are today or tonight, depending on where we are in the world, again honoring and celebrating the life of our former colleague. He was a brilliant student during his LLB studies, which, as you will know, he completed summa cum laude, and he received the prize for being the best LLB law student in 2006. He thereafter completed an LLM degree in International Trade and Investment Law at UWC, and he completed an LLM degree in Dispute Resolution at the University of Missouri in 2008. And this is where our keynote speaker tonight, Professor Uphoff, is based at the UWC Missouri Educational Program Director. He will be introduced later by Professor Franz. But just a few words, Professor Uphoff, as I understand it, and his wife, Marsha, take extremely good care of the UWC students during their year at Missouri. They are like substitute parents, and they also, I believe, acted as such during the scholarship of Ivan. It is thus very appropriate for Professor Uphoff to present the keynote address today. The student from UWC is granted the scholarship each year, thanks to a great extent to Professor Uphoff, to study at the University of Missouri, and it is now named after Ivan Rugema, one of the first recipients of the scholarship. So to conclude, welcome again to all of you to this event, and thank you to the family of Ivan Rugema and also to Professor Mesmore for making this event possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jacques Deville, Dean of the Faculty of Law, for those kind words, but also for the recognition that has been bestowed upon Ivan, a very deserved recognition. We have the privilege of receiving, similar to last year, a video message from Ivan Rugema's family. So I'm going to ask my colleague to share that video from Ivan's family. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon and warm greetings to you all from Kigali, Rwanda. It is truly an honor to have you all with us today as we honor and celebrate the life of our son, brother, uncle, friend, Ivan Rugema, with a second memorial lecture. I thank you all. My family and I extend a special and heartfelt thanks to the University of Western Cape, Ivan's home for close to 12 years, for keeping Ivan's memory alive and for continuing to honor him by hosting the memorial lecture. Professor Benjamin Dawit Mezmur, I cannot express my gratitude enough for your friendship to Ivan and for the time dedicated to honoring his legacy by organizing last year's and today's memorial lecture. I would also like to thank Professor Uphoff from the University of Missouri for agreeing to give the lecture today. Professor Rodney Uphoff, not only were you Ivan's professor during his time at the University of Missouri, you also held a special place in Ivan's heart and made his time in Missouri truly memorable. It is our honor to have you here with us today. To all his friends, former colleagues, many of whom we consider to be part of our extended family, that I'm not going to mention by name today, we appreciate you all. Many on the call today know Ivan, but for those that are joining us for the first time, Ivan earned the Bachelor of Laws and the Master of Laws in International Trade and Investment Law from the University of Western Cape. He pursued a second Master of Laws in Dispute Resolution at the University of Missouri. Beginning in 2009, he served as a lecturer at the Department of Criminal Justice and Procedure, while at the same time pursuing a PhD in International Trade and Investment at the University of Western Cape, to the time of his passing in 2014. Ivan was a very just young man. He was always ready to advocate for anyone whose voice he felt was not represented or adequately listened to. He was also always ready and well equipped for a debate. I personally spent many evenings discussing and debating many world issues with him. It therefore was no surprise that his work and career was dedicated to the law. Calm in demeanor, deeply intuitive, disciplined, hardworking, and with a constant thirst for knowledge, he approached everyone and everything he did with humility. With a constant thirst for knowledge, few things gave him more pleasure than teaching. He was dedicated to his students and loved his UWC community dearly. As impressive and distinctive as Ivan's achievements were in life, it was his character that stood out most. I believe that is the reason we are all gathered here today. We came here today because he touched many of us in a special way. He inspired us and challenged us to be better. His integrity, kindness, resilience, discipline, grit, consistency, and deep compassion are some of the many things that made Ivan truly exemplary human being. Through the life he chose and how he lived, it was clear that he was deliberate in choosing the things that he believed to matter most in life. While he pursued excellency, he never forgot to help and pay the way forward for those he could along the way. He lived the life of service, giving always to his family, friends, and to his students before himself. And while he worked hard, he always made time and never forgot his loved ones. He lived the life of service, reminding us that how we use our gifts to impact others matters more than the gift itself. That is Ivan's legacy. If we can take this page out of Ivan's book, it is my belief that we will have gone a long way in keeping his legacy alive. On behalf of my family, I thank you all once again for honoring Ivan Rugema. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that very beautiful, clear, and a loud message coming from the family. And as Ivan, almost all of us here know Ivan. We have been privileged to share a lot of those things that were mentioned about him. Just 2 or 3 points that caught my attention. When his father said he actually used his voice for those that were not well represented, but actually more importantly, he was well equipped for a debate, and you can actually have long debates with him on all sorts of things, particularly issues that are of significant importance for the African continent. That definitely resonated well with me. One thing that I clearly remember, even when he disagreed, he was actually able to do it without being disagreeable, which is actually one quality which is often in short supply these days. And it's something that I've always appreciated about Ivan. One of the points that was mentioned is that he was very much dedicated to his students. Absolutely, he was very passionate about his students. He would be very frustrated when his students didn't perform well. I've had some of those conversations along with other colleagues about some of those frustrations that he had, but also he was exceptionally happy when his students performed very well. Now, taking this into account, we actually felt as a faculty organizing this, we felt that it would actually be critical and important to hear from his student, at least one student, but also someone who's actually worked with him closely, someone who was a tutor for his course. So we have the privilege of Miss Kamila Yusuf, who was a tutor for Ivan's course in 2011. And she's kindly agreed to share a few words in respect of her working relationship with Ivan as a tutor for his course. So without taking much time, I invite Ms. Yusuf to address us. Over to you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I first heard of Ivan in 2007 when I was a first year at the Faculty of Law. More specifically, I heard of Ivan among the international student community, specifically the East African community, about how he excelled with his LLB degree. A few years down the line, when I finished my LLB, I was selected to be a GLA. So I was selected to be part of the GLA program. More privileged I was to be Ivan Rugema's tutor. I worked with Ivan for 2 years, and Ivan was a dedicated lecturer, a natural teacher. He ensured that we as his GLA knew the content of the work before we walked into the lecture halls to ensure that his students received the best that he could. But moreover, Ivan was a mentor to all of us. He was a friend. He was a person who was very kind, very generous with his time. You could walk in his office and he would be more than welcoming to you and to assist you whenever he could. I recall a personal experience with Ivan. I was placed to tutor a part-time group. And if I'm to be very honest, I was very intimidated by the group. It was mostly quite an older group compared to my age. So I walked into his office and I told him, Mr. Rugema, I do not think I can take this group. And he was very concerned and he told me why. And I told him, well, is it the content? And I said, no, it's not the content. I know the work. It's the age of the students. And he smiled, walked over his desk and closed the door and he told me, have a seat. And he told me, Ms. Yusuf, you have to believe that you have the power to take this lecture. So as long as you know the work, you are going to walk into that lecture hall and you're going to show the students what you got. And this is just to show you what kind of person he was. He would be more than glad to assist you, even if it means to give you a burst of confidence. And that's what he did. And I walked into that lecture hall and I delivered. So when I was asked to speak something about Ivan by Professor Mesmore, I will quote what I say. I told him, Ivan was the coolest person to work with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yusuf, for those very useful and kind words. And I'm also glad that you actually quoted yourself. I'm glad I didn't preempt you when Ivan's family, his father, Mr. Michael, said, when he said, thank you for organizing this, I was just saying to myself, this is probably the easiest organization that I actually need to do. I will be very honest with you, 90% of it was done on WhatsApp. So I could just speak to Moses, Ivan's brother, whom I've known for a number of years, an excellent guy, an excellent professional, a very dedicated diplomat for the government of Rwanda, but someone who's championed a number of causes that are of interest for the African continent. So I spent 90% of the planning on WhatsApp, and it was very easy to contact Camilla and others. And Camilla said, you know, absolutely. She didn't even ask me what time it was and what day it was. She just said he was the coolest guy to actually work for. So thank you very much for sharing those words. The next speaker that we have is someone who's actually been a very close friend of Ivan. His name is Hakim Salum. I've known Hakim for a number of years, as long as I've known Ivan. So Hakim, it's over to you, please. I'm not sure if I see Hakim in the Nakhla, can you move Hakim Salum to the panelists, please? In the meantime, as we do that, I will move to the next speaker, and we will hear from Mr. Salum shortly. Of course, it would be incomplete to have this conversation, as I mentioned earlier, without hearing from someone who was a student of Ivan. As was mentioned, Ivan was a dedicated lecturer. He loved his students. If he had frustrations, it's because the students didn't perform well as much as he expected and so forth. And he cherished when they actually performed exceptionally well. And we thought it would be ideal to have a student speak. Today we have Ms. Shiti Salati. She's a former student, legal counsel, Standard Chartered Bank PLC, and she's from Zambia. So Ms. Salati, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So, you know, when I was approached by my former lecturer, Hakim, to say a few words about Ivan, I didn't even hesitate because of the kind of person that he was. So I first met Ivan when I was in my first year, and he was in my lecture at the time. But one of the things that struck me was the quiet authority that he carried himself with. And over the years, I got to know him, and he then became my lecturer in my third year. We interacted over a number over those years, and what I got to know about him was he was extremely intelligent, he was steadfast, he was humble, he was kind, he was caring, but also he was also quite stern. And despite this sternness, he remained approachable. And one of the ways in which he did this was he maintained an open door policy with his students, and he was always available whenever we needed him, and even outside his consultation hours. And to us international students, one of the things that we looked up to him for, and one of the things that he exemplified, was the students that we hoped to be, and the students that our fee-paying parents needed us to be, because he was an A student. And what I will personally always remember was whenever I met Ivan on campus, whether he was in a hurry or not, he always stopped to find out how I was coping with school and how I was doing generally, because he understood that I was away from home. That's something that came to mean something to me. And, you know, most of his attributes are things I've tried to emulate in my professional and academic life. And even as he's passed on, I think everyone can attest to the fact that he's left a legacy of excellence, a legacy of humility, and you know, may he continue resting in peace.
Thank you very much, Ms. Salati, for those words. We, not just only the students, but also even us as lecturers, knew very well that he valued his students. I personally also remember conversations when he came to the office over a weekend to actually mark or to give feedback to students on a Monday, and so forth. And what you just shared with us is once again a reconfirmation, even though sometimes we actually feel that there might be power relations between lecturers and students, and Sometimes it's also a culture. I think Ivan was actually a very easy person to speak to. I often remember the lines, because he was my next door neighbor, the lines outside of his office, despite the fact that it was not necessarily a consultation hour. So, Ms. Salati, thank you very much. But also one of the important aspects from what you said is also the inspirational role that he actually played, not just only as someone who came to UWC as a foreign student, but a young, but also very bright, very well balanced person who actually managed to strike a good balance between his professional life, his social life, and so forth. So thank you for that reconfirmation. Now that I see Mr. Saloom, Mr. Hakim Saloom has been moved to the panelists, and we apologize for that error. I want to give the opportunity to him. So it's over to you now. Hakim? Maybe the connection, am I the only one? I think there may be a connection.
I don't know whether you can hear me.
Okay, now we can hear you. Please go ahead, Hakim.
So, firstly, I would like to thank you. I'd like to thank Ben. Okay. Hi, Ben, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Ben,
can hear
should I
you.
go ahead? Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Right. I hope you don't mind. I want the video stay off. Unfortunately, I got stuck in traffic. On my way home, so I'm trying to do this from the car. So apologies for that.
No worries. Go ahead. We can hear you now. It sounds
Oh, yeah.
better.
All right. So I wanted to first say thank you to yourself, firstly, University of the Western Cape, University of Missouri, for having continuously being able to celebrate Ivan's life. And I'm going to be very honest. When you contacted me, Ben, I think when you contacted me to give a speech, I'm not going to lie, I was nervous. I think up to now, I think you can tell from my voice. And I think the nervousness is actually twofold. The nervous is twofold because firstly, I felt a massive responsibility to honor Ivan's legacy, to say the right words, to give a good picture, a great picture of the great person that he was. But also, I think ever since he passed, this might be the first time I speak about him in public. So, so as we go through this, I will certainly ask that you bear with me. It's a bit of an emotional roller coaster. Yeah. So as I was going through the bio that was on the link, it actually struck me that we actually had very similar journeys. I mean, I also started out at UWC for my undergrad. I was fortunate enough to get the Missouri scholarship to do the master's in ADR. I also came back at UWC as a faculty member. So in a way, I was definitely shadowing Ivan's path. So as I was trying to figure out what to say for today, I tried to put down a couple of keywords or phrases that might give a good picture of Ivan. But by the time I was done putting in the words, I was for sure not going to be within the 5 to 10 minute slot. So I tried to summarize. I've tried to summarize a few things that perhaps is a reflection of what Ivan meant to me and his friends in general. Sorry about that. I think the first thing I want to mention is that Ivan was a massive mentor. I don't think anybody knows this, but I think Ivan was the one who was responsible for my application at UWC. I had an elder brother that was also studying in Cape Town, but unfortunately, he wasn't really too bothered about following up on the application. So I kept asking him, yo, how far with my papers? Am I in? Am I out? Should I look for another uni? And he kept telling me the same thing. Yo, just relax. I have somebody who's handling it, and I really trust this guy. So little did I know that particular person was Ivan. So actually, when I came right into straight out my first year. So Ivan played a massive role in my life. Actually, he played the big brother role so effortlessly. And of course, here I was in my late teens, foreign country, I guess first time to live outside East Africa. So it was, the role that he played was massive. I was lucky enough to have a brother in Cape Town as well, but not in Belleville, where the campus is located. So Ivan was able to mentor me. He mentored me academically. He constantly followed up on my grades. Even when I did well, he would push me to do much better. He also, most importantly, mentored me with off-campus issues. Like I mentioned earlier, coming to a foreign country in my late teens. Of course, distractions are easily accessible, if I may use that word. And I actually remember him telling me frequently to keep my eye on the prize. And he would joke, or perhaps not so much jokingly, he would always let me know, hey man, don't let these attractive girls be a distraction. You know what you came here for? We are foreigners in this country, so we must make sure that by the time we leave, we're on top of our class. Then, of course, as the months went on, I really didn't know about Ivan's academic excellence. But like everybody knew, it doesn't take too long to know about Ivan. Actually, there's a little funny story that I used to tell my classmates, is that, because I remember, I think this was before the names were rubbed out from the coursework marks. So we'd always have names, surname, student number, and the person's coursework mark. I remember every time I would go have a look at Ivan's grades, 10 times out of 10, he had the highest mark. And he had ridiculous marks. He would have a 92 coursework mark, an 85 coursework mark, an 81 coursework mark. So I was like, yo, is this guy human? What's going on? So anyway, so the first word I really wanted to put out there is that Ivan was a massive mentor to me. And like what Chiti and Camila have said as well, to a massive crowd of international, for foreign students. And it actually didn't matter whether in the law faculty, in the business faculty, in the science faculty, I would continuously find students in his office. Students, when you're still staying on campus, I'd find students in his room. I was like, yo, when does this guy get time for himself? The second thing I wanted to highlight is that I have never, ever met someone so humble. So, like I mentioned earlier, excuse me about that. So like I mentioned earlier, Ivan was always top of his class throughout his undergraduate studies, all the way to his postgraduate studies. So the one thing that I have learned and I'm trying to emulate is humility. And like I mentioned earlier, I am yet to meet a person who is so humble, yet so excellent in his works. He was an excellent student, excellent teacher, excellent brother, excellent son, excellent partner. But the level of humility that he carried himself with, I don't think I'll ever meet somebody as humble. The other word that kept coming out when I was thinking about this is respectful. I mean, it really surprised me in the manner that he treated everybody with the same level of respect. It didn't really matter whether it was the cleaners that were cleaning our rooms or the cleaners in the offices, whether it was the dean, whether it was the students, whether it was somebody on the street. His level of respect always maintained the same. And I actually remember, unfortunately, when he fell ill, and of course, he'd have bad days, but even in those bad days, the way he would express his frustration was so polite. So, like I said, I'm still taken back by the level of respect and politeness that he had. I would also like to add that Ivan was a massive inspiration. He was a massive inspiration to myself, massive inspiration to those in the faculty, massive inspiration to those outside the faculty, massive inspiration to those that are outside the university. So he was truly, truly, truly inspirational. And like I said earlier, this is a guy who was top of his class, but still remained so humble. And if I may be honest, one of the ways that I was truly inspired was when he fell ill. So, sorry for this.
Take your time, Hakim.
Okay. So when he fell ill, actually, actually remember taking him to the hospital. Yeah, so, oh gosh. All right. Okay. I don't think I have it in me to complete, but let me try. So when he fell ill, he was so calm about it. He was so positive about it. He was okay, this is getting difficult. All right. Okay. Sorry, Ben. This seems to be harder than I thought.
You can take 30 seconds. You can put your mic off, and we will just wait for you.
No, it's okay. Yeah. So when he fell ill, like I said, he was so positive. He never complained. He handled it with so much grace, and I was personally inspired because this is such a great human being who was going through such a rough time, but he handled it with so much grace at the same time. So, I mean, there's so many other words I had to say, but I think it's best to start concluding. So, I mean, one of the words that I can perhaps say that can summarize Ivan's legacy is the word honorable. So Ivan, really an honorable guy. So from the respect that he gave others, to his cool, calm demeanor, to his honesty, compassion, and grace, I can only sum it up as he was truly an honorable person. So as I conclude, I want to take a quote. I want to take a quote from the book of Micah. So I want to take a quote from the book of Micah. The book of Micah, which is chapter 6, verse 8. And it reads, "He has shown you, excuse me, he has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you?" And the response is to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. And I just want to repeat that one, the final sentence: to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. I can confidently state that Ivan definitely acted justly, he loved mercy, and he undoubtedly walked humbly. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Hakim. I can, along with everybody else, appreciate that this is actually very emotional. But thank you very much for taking the time for sharing what you talked about Ivan and what he definitely stood for. It's interesting how, including from last November 19 Memorial Lecture, that we had the words such as inspirational, mentor, honorable, they keep on coming. It's not by default, it's by design, because that's how he related with everybody, with his students, with his colleagues, with others who worked in the faculty, but even outside of the faculty. And it's not just only an inspiration for the students or the foreign students that were postgraduate students or undergraduate students at UWC, but everybody who actually interacted with them. And in a way, it says quite a bit about the family that he comes from as well. So it's not just only about Ivan himself, but also the family that he comes from. Without taking much time, I'm going to ask Professor Joseph Franz, who is the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation, to kindly introduce the speaker for today's memorial lecture. Over to you.
Good afternoon, colleagues, friends, family of the late Ivan Rugema. I did not have the privilege to know Ivan Rugema, but this afternoon I want to say that for all of us here listening to this, I want to leave you with a question. Are you striving to leave a legacy or a eulogy? Now, a legacy is a tick list of successful items, but a eulogy is the impact you have made in people's lives. And this afternoon, I can definitely hear that Ivan left a good eulogy because he impacted people's lives. The reflections here this evening is that about someone who was able to make a difference in the lives of those people who he came in contact with. And I want to salute this evening his family for raising such a wonderful son and giving us here at UWC the opportunity to have engaged with him. So colleagues and friends, let me take this opportunity to do what I've been called to do. It is indeed an honor for me to introduce a good friend, someone who we can call family here at UWC, to do this lecture. I think we could not have chosen a better person in the person of Professor Uphoff to do this lecture here this evening. Professor Uphoff is obviously a professor at law. He served as an Associate Dean of Academic Affairs for 3 years at the University of Missouri. Professor Uphoff has been the director of the University of Missouri South Africa Educational Program for more than 10 years, almost 15 years. And he has played a major role in creating opportunities for not only staff and students. That is the type of person that we are talking about here this evening. While Professor Uphoff in his capacity as a lawyer, he joined the Missouri University in 2001, and he taught also at the University of Oklahoma College of Law, where he served as a professor, a director of clinical legal education, and he ran a criminal defense clinic for 10 years. This speaks of someone who has experience not only as a teacher to teach others, but also as someone who has definite experience. And experience speaks volumes when you want to share a story. So in 1995, Professor Uphoff was appointed by the Governor Frank Keating to the Oklahoma Indigent System Board, which oversees the operation of Oklahoma's public defender program in all countries except for 2. Now in 2009, he was appointed the Big 12 representative to the NCAA Infractions Committee. And Uphoff has spoken at several conferences and at several, I'm sure, keynote addresses. But I want to just share one thing with you is that he was appointed as a member on the trial of, I think it's Terry Nicholas in Oklahoma State Court. And that trial received quite a bit of coverage. And at the end of the trial, Nicholas did not receive the death penalty, even though this was what would have been the case. And so we're thinking this evening that we are drawing on a person who has really got a good skill set and lots of experience and lots of wisdom to share with us this evening. We as the University of the Western Cape recognizes Prof. Uphoff as a valuable member who contributes and stakeholder who contributes continuously to our university. And last year, we recognized him in a special award through our annual research recognition awards for the role he has played in driving research here at UWC and capacitating our staff and our students through exchanges. And so the next person you will hear after my voice is that of Professor Rodney Uphoff. I welcome you.
Thank you very much, Professor Franz, for those very kind words. Those of you from UWC who know me know that UWC is a very special place for me. It really is my second country, my second family, and my second community. So it's a great honor for me to speak and to give this lecture today, in part because of the special place in my heart that UWC holds, but also because of the special place in my heart that Ivan holds. I got to know Ivan extremely well when he was in Missouri. He was a brilliant student, and then he came back to UWC, and he was an amazing young lecturer. But I think what we've heard today, and what I certainly knew, that Ivan was a very, very special person. And he had a passion for justice. And I think my remarks today are something that I think he would enjoy listening to, because my talk is about justice. So imagine that your brother, your father, your son, your friend was arrested and convicted for a crime that he didn't commit, and he's now in prison. And imagine also that you actually testified at his trial because you knew, in fact, that he couldn't have committed the crime he was accused of committing because he was home with you. Nonetheless, the jury didn't believe the alibi, didn't believe your testimony, and now your son is in prison for a long period of time. That happened to a lawyer in Georgia whose son was convicted of several rapes and stayed in prison for 15 years until DNA exonerated that young man. But unfortunately, his father died before his son was ultimately released from prison. Now, we're reassured because most of us believe that this kind of thing only happens 1 in a million cases, because the American criminal justice system, like many criminal justice systems, has all sorts of built-in safeguards, a presumption of innocence, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the assistance of counsel, all designed to ensure that we don't convict an innocent person. And in fact, we have built so many safeguards in, supposedly, in theory, at least in the United States, we would prefer to see 100 guilty people go free rather than one innocent person be convicted. Unfortunately, that theory doesn't play out that way in practice. And the reality in the United States, and unfortunately in other countries around the world, is that we are sending people to prison, innocent people to prison, more often than we really believe. Could I have my first slide, please? So you might be a bit confused when you see this first slide, and it says why the United States criminal justice systems don't always get it right. I think it's important to note that in the United States, there are really 51 different criminal justice systems, because we have a federal criminal justice system and every state has their own individual system. And in the United States, the quality of justice varies very much from state to state and system to system. Next slide. So the question that you might have is, how common are these wrongful convictions? Well, actually, it's impossible to say for sure. Some defenders of the system argue that it's very rare, but most scholars and I disagree. I think it's happening a lot more than people recognize. And in fact, there have been 2,807 documented exonerations occurring in the United States since 1989. Next slide. But I think that is only the tip of the iceberg. And the reason I say that is because in the United States, the vast majority of criminal cases are not decided by a jury trial or a trial to a judge. The vast majority, over 95% of the cases in the United States, are resolved by plea bargaining. And unfortunately, there are people who plead guilty even though they are innocent because they don't want to risk an even longer sentence in prison, so they take advantage of a plea bargain despite the fact they're innocent. How do we know that? Well, in the first study of DNA cases, and just to back things up a bit, DNA testing didn't really start happening in the United States until 1989. Before that time, we had no conclusive way to prove that an innocent person was in fact guilty until DNA evidence started to be introduced. And from 1989 to 1996, the FBI did a study of sexual assault cases where people were arrested and believed to be the perpetrator in a criminal offense. And the police department sent 10,000 of these cases, all of which were based on eyewitness identification testimony, sent 10,000 cases to the FBI crime lab in Washington. And unfortunately, over 20% of the cases, the DNA evidence showed that the arrested person was not in fact the perpetrator. And why this is significant is that in over 90% of the cases in the United States, there is no DNA evidence. There is no magic bullet that can show conclusively that a person who's been identified is not the perpetrator. So in the vast majority of cases, we don't have access to DNA. A study in 2012 in Virginia showed that between 5 to 7% of the people in prison were not the source of DNA and were probably not the perpetrator of the crime. So I think that gives you an idea of the fact that there may be a significant number of people in prison, certainly not the majority, but people are estimating that there may be as many as 10% of people in prison today in the United States who are in fact innocent of the crime. Go down just a little bit lower on that slide. In fact, in the DNA exonerations, 11% of the 375 DNA exonerations in the United States, the people had pled guilty. And in 29% of those cases, the DNA exonerees had given a false confession. Next slide. Now, why is this important? It's important for two reasons. First, we don't want to see innocent people in prison. That's terrible. But second, when we get it wrong, when the system gets it wrong, in the 375 DNA exonerations, in 165 of those cases, they later identified the actual assailant through DNA, and they found that these actual assailants went on to convict 154 cases while the innocent person was in prison and the guilty person was out committing new crimes. So it's a very significant public safety issue. Next slide. These are the 6 major causes in the United States, and I think not only in the United States, but around the world. And I say that because I've taught comparative criminal justice in Germany, Austria, Romania, England, Turkey, and in many of Japan, and in many of these countries, the problems that we have in the United States there are similar problems in other countries, and that includes South Africa as well. Eyewitness identification. It's the major way that crimes around the world are solved. And unfortunately, eyewitness identification is not foolproof, as we will see in a later slide. False confessions, bad science, snitch testimony, police or prosecutorial misconduct, ineffective assistance to defense counsel. These are the major factors which contribute to wrongful convictions. Next slide. So in that 375 DNA exonerations, 69% of the cases involved a wrongful eyewitness identification. In 32% of those cases, multiple witnesses had picked out the innocent person and identified that person as the actual perpetrator. And then later, 36% of the misidentifications, subsequently DNA revealed who the actual perpetrator was. And on average, sadly, the innocent person spent 14 years in prison before the actual perpetrator was identified. Next slide. So for me, I went to a conference at Harvard way back in the early part of the 1990s. And I learned about a case involving Ronald Cotton because Jennifer Thompson was a speaker at this conference. It was actually in the early 2000s, 2004, I believe. Jennifer Thompson was a co-ed at a university in North Carolina, and she was raped, and her rapist was there for over 20 to 30 minutes during the rape. And during that rape, she later talked about how she studied every aspect of the rapist, all his facial features, everything about his body, so that she could, if she survived, she said, she wanted to be able to make sure that she could identify the right person. She identified Ronald Cotton in a lineup, and Ronald Cotton served 10 years in prison. There was another person along with Jennifer Thompson who identified Ronald Cotton, and Jennifer Thompson was, as she said, 100% sure that Ronald Cotton was the perpetrator. And the police chief, who also spoke at this conference, said in his entire time working for the police force, he was never more positive that Jennifer Thompson had accurately picked out the right person in picking out Ronald Cotton. Unfortunately, Jennifer Thompson was 100% wrong. And the actual perpetrator was Mr. Poole, who, after the DNA exonerated Ronald Cotton, correctly identified Mr. Poole as the perpetrator. But not only did Mr. Cotton spend 10 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, but Mr. Poole went on to commit a number of offenses before he was actually caught. Next slide. So in Georgia, the legislature had a task force that looked into the problems of wrongful convictions. They identified eyewitness error as the major problem. They also stressed this problem with the real perpetrator remaining free if we don't get it right in the first instance. And there's been a lot of scientific research done on the whole issue of eyewitness identification. And they demonstrate not only that many people have memory difficulties, which make the ability to accurately pick out the right person and identify the right person. Many people cannot do that. And studies consistently show that as many as 30 to 40% of people in research studies are unable to accurately identify the right person. So you can have well-intentioned witnesses and well-intentioned police authorities who unfortunately inadvertently are undermining the accuracy of identifications. There are safeguards and procedures that exist, but they are not implemented enough around the United States, around other countries in the world. Next slide. These are a number of the states that have began to or have introduced and implemented eyewitness identification reform. Unfortunately, you don't see Missouri on that list. Next slide. The second thing that I would like to talk about is false confessions. And I'm sure for many of you, you might find it hard to believe that people will admit to committing a crime that they didn't actually commit. It's something that my students have a lot of difficulty wrapping their arms around or getting their heads into, because it seems so difficult to believe that innocent people will in fact commit to crimes. If you could click on that YouTube link. Maybe you should double click on it.
Is it not showing? Is it showing?
I'm not seeing it, and I don't know if anyone else is seeing it.
No, it's not
I don't
showing.
think it's showing. So I'll skip over and just briefly talk about this link. Chris Ochoa was a young teenager in Texas. Don't worry about it. Young teenager in Texas. He was working at a fast food place. The police came in and there had been a murder in that fast food place, and they arrested Chris Ochoa and one of his coworkers, brought them in and subjected him to 2 days of interrogation. And as Chris Ochoa would report on this YouTube slide, after a while, he just was worn out, exhausted, and he told the police whatever they wanted to hear. And in essence, he ended up saying that he had killed this young woman, when in fact, he never had killed the young woman. And he talks in this YouTube video about how difficult it is to overcome the pressure that skilled investigators put on people. And skilled investigators virtually can get almost anyone to testify. They're particularly good at getting young and vulnerable people and people with mental health issues. But the reason I selected the Chris Ochoa case as an example is that Chris Ochoa was extremely bright. After he served 11 years in prison, he ended up going to the University of Wisconsin and graduating from law school, and he's now a successful lawyer. So it's not just the vulnerable and the mentally ill who can be tricked or pressured into false confessions. It can happen to a lot of normal, smart people as well. Next slide. So what do we do to try to deal with the problem of false confessions? Around the United States, there are increasingly demands for and legislation that is requiring that the police videotape or at least audio tape all interrogations. And that's a move that's happened in a few other countries as well. In the UK, they now require audio taped interrogations. Unfortunately, there are many places in the United States that do not require, and it's only the police officer who will say what the defendant supposedly said in the interrogation room. Next slide. We'll pass over that slide as well. It's just a few states have done things to make improvements, but unfortunately it's not enough. Next slide. So the third major factor that contributes to wrongful convictions is bad science. And in fact, in 24% of the wrongful convictions nationally, bad science, and by bad science, I mean sometimes there are scientists who are actually claiming that there are scientific principles which help them identify the perpetrator, when in fact there is no valid scientific principles backing up their alleged testimony. In other cases, there are outright mistakes, and in some cases, there are misconduct by forensic, so-called forensic experts who will offer testimony that ends up leading to the conviction of innocent people. Next slide. These are just a few of the scientific areas. Hair comparison, it was used all over the United States, but it now has been scaled way back. Hair comparisons add only minimal value and not the so-called 100% match that many expert witnesses would testify about, which ultimately led judges and jurors to believe that hair testimony was really critical. And if you watch shows like CSI on television, you believe that hair testimony is really valuable when it really isn't. Arson is a second example, comparative bullet lead analysis. Another thing that the FBI used for many years, they testified in over 2,500 cases about this, and they've now withdrawn their testimony because there are no scientific principles to back up this testimony. Next slide. The fourth category of testimony, or fourth factor that leads to wrongful convictions, is snitch testimony. What I mean by snitch testimony is the police get, usually, not always, but oftentimes, jailhouse informants who claim that the defendant told them that they did it, or offered incriminating information, and then the jailhouse informant would go into court, and the jailhouse informant would testify convincingly that the defendant, in essence, admitted that he perpetrated the crime. And that's pretty compelling evidence to juries. And in fact, in many of the wrongful conviction cases, snitch testimony is one of the critical factors that leads to the conviction. Next slide. Sadly enough, police and prosecutorial misconduct is a major factor, and it shouldn't be. We shouldn't have examples of police lying about evidence, or prosecutors withholding exculpatory evidence that actually shows that the defendant didn't commit the crime, but they never provide that information to the defense, so the judge and jury never hear about this information. And I'm not here to say that this is a common problem. The vast majority of police officers in the United States and the vast majority of prosecutors behave appropriately, and the vast majority of convictions in the United States are proper. But it is a sad fact that we still have too many cases where police and prosecutors engage in just outright, what I would call criminal behavior, in hiding evidence or in failing to provide defense the information that they are constitutionally and ethically obligated to provide, but they don't give that information to the court or to the defense. Next slide. So police officers in 35% of the DNA exoneration cases, that's the 375 cases where DNA showed that the defendants were absolutely innocent, 35 of those cases, police officers were involved in either witness tampering, some misconduct in the interrogation process, or fabricated evidence. And in 30% of those cases, the prosecutors were involved in some kind of misconduct. Next slide. This is just one of the horrific examples of prosecutorial misconduct. Michael Morton was in a Texas case. He spent 25 years in prison for the murder of his wife. Finally, he was released in 2011 when DNA evidence exonerated him and actually implicated another man in the murder of his wife, who had also been involved in the murder of another woman 2 years after Michael Morton's wife was murdered. Next slide. So this was the evidence. They had evidence. Eric was the son, and Eric was at the house when his mom was murdered. And Eric told the police that a monster had come in and murdered his mother. Eric's testimony was never given to the defense. The jury never heard it. There was a green van that was seen by another number of neighbors outside of the house right before the murder. That information was not provided to the defense or to the jury. And the wife's, Christine's credit card was used by somebody not long after the murder. That information was not provided to the judge or to the defense attorneys. So the prosecutor in that case ultimately left the prosecutor's office, was elected a judge, and at the time of this, Mr. Morton was exonerated. Mr. Anderson was his name, was a judge. They found that he had violated criminal laws by concealing evidence. They charged him with the crime of criminal contempt, tampering with evidence for concealing this exculpatory information from the trial judge. The State Bar of Texas brought ethics charges against him. Finally, Mr. Anderson entered a plea and spent 10 days in jail, resigned his position as district court judge, and surrendered his law license. But think about that. Mr. Anderson gets a 10-day jail sentence. Mr. Morton spends 25 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Is that justice? Next slide. And I will say one of the sad things about that case involving Michael Morton, that is one of the rare cases when prosecutors are held accountable for their misconduct. There are only a handful of cases around the United States, despite the number of cases that prosecutors engage in misconduct. There's only a handful of cases where those prosecutors suffer any legal consequences. The last topic I'd like to talk about before I end is ineffective assistance of counsel. In the United States and in many countries around the world, defendants are guaranteed the right to effective assistance of counsel. And in fact, good lawyers are the key to making sure that the safeguards that our system provides are in fact carried out. Because if you don't have a good lawyer, your right to cross-examination, your right to proof beyond a reasonable doubt doesn't mean very much. And unfortunately, in the United States, the quality of lawyering varies significantly. The vast majority of defendants in the United States are represented by an indigent defender. So that's a lawyer who's paid for by the state, not by a private lawyer. And in some jurisdictions in the United States, like Wisconsin, where I practice, in Washington, D.C., Colorado, Massachusetts, Oregon, there are certain states where if you're a poor person and you get assigned a public defender, you're going to get a very good lawyer. Unfortunately, there are a number of states in the United States where you're not going to get a good lawyer. In Oklahoma, for example, they have contract lawyers who are paid less than $100 a case. And for $100, you don't get much legal assistance at all. And unfortunately, here in Missouri, our public defender's office is one of the most underfunded in the country, and that adversely affects the rights of both guilty defendants to get the effective assistance of counsel, but it really penalizes the innocent because without the effective assistance of counsel, what many of those people do is they end up pleading guilty because they don't want to go to trial and risk a life sentence or a 20-year sentence with a lawyer who hasn't done any investigation, hasn't done any work on their case. Last slide. In fact, this slide is too busy of a slide, but the thrust of this slide is that there is many indigent defenders in the United States who do not have access to an investigator. And if they don't have an investigator, there isn't somebody to go out and interview witnesses and uncover the evidence that can challenge the state's case and lead a good trial lawyer to possibly winning in front of a judge or jury when one has a trial. So last slide and end of slides, and I'll just go back to talking. So unfortunately, this is not a pretty picture. And it's not a pretty picture because there are reforms that we can introduce in the United States that will minimize, won't eliminate, but it will minimize wrongful convictions. But those reforms oftentimes take money. And in the United States and in other countries around the world, where there's competing needs for education, for roads, for medical care, healthcare, spending money on the criminal justice system is not what most governments want to do. And the end result is, and we are learning this lesson from DNA, unfortunately, our criminal justice systems are not as just and not as effective and not as efficient as we thought they were. Thank you very much. I'll take questions now.
Thank you very much, Professor Uphoff, for that very illuminating presentation. Even though you're actually speaking about the experience in a number of states within the United States, it actually resonated very well with me in terms of some of the challenges that we're facing in the criminal justice system here in South Africa, some of the challenges that we face in my own country in Ethiopia. And I'm not surprised that some of these challenges are also being experienced in many African countries. And starting from the data issue where if you don't count, you won't be counted. That notion that actually says how many and so forth. Starting from the data issue, it's a very challenging subject matter. There are a few comments and questions that have been put forward in the chat. So I'm just going to take them one by one or try to collect. The first one says, from Emmanuel, is there any specific reason why the state of Missouri is not on the list of states implementing the eyewitness identification program? And
yeah, that's a good question. Unfortunately, I actually testified several times in support of legislation to adopt the eyewitness identification reforms that have been identified in other states. But the Missouri legislature listened more to the police lobbyists, and the police lobbyists claimed there was no need for the reforms that I talk about. That's because I think there are still too many people that have an unrealistic belief in the accuracy of eyewitness identification testimony. Let's face it, we need all over the world, we need eyewitness identification testimony. It's the way we solve most crimes. So we need to be able to rely on eyewitnesses. Unfortunately, what I've learned over the last 30 years in studying this issue and reading lots of research on it is it becomes really difficult to separate for a judge or the jury, and judges are no better at this than jurors, to separate who are the accurate witnesses from the inaccurate witnesses. So if Jennifer Thompson testified in front of any judge in the United States, and I would say any judge in the world, and they heard her convincing testimony about how she studied the face of the person, and she's sure that Ronald Cotton is the person, that judge or that jury is going to convict Ronald Cotton. Now, the problem in that case was there were errors made during the photo lineup and the other in-person lineup, which contributed to her false belief that Ronald Cotton was the person she was actually remembering. And so it's unfortunate that Missouri hasn't adopted this reform, but it's because there are still people in the prosecution and the police who have unrealistic faith in the accuracy of eyewitness identification testimony.
Thank you very much. That's very useful. There is a related point that Claire has mentioned. I know she said that you've actually sort of answered it, but I think I'm going to come to it because it resonates very well in the context of South Africa too. We often ask ourselves, are we actually criminalizing poverty in a way? The more you're actually closer to the poverty line, the higher chances that you would actually find yourself in the wrong side of the law. So the question is, to what extent does economic standing of a suspect affect access to accurate convictions? And then do we see more wrongful convictions among the low-income suspects because they can't access comprehensive legal representation? So you've touched on it. So if you can expound on it, that would be excellent.
Right.
Professor.
That's really an excellent question. And it's certainly economic status matters, but it's more interesting. The interesting answer is it matters more depending upon where you live in the United States. So if you're a poor person, and I'll use Wisconsin as an example because I know it very well. If you're a poor person in Wisconsin and you qualify for a public defender, you're actually going to get better representation, a better lawyer, a better investigator, access to expert witnesses, and you have a chance to get a fair outcome than if you are a lower middle class person because you don't qualify for a public defender, but now you have to go out and hire a lawyer and you really can't afford to hire a good lawyer. So you have to hire a lawyer who doesn't have the time and energy, access to an investigator, access to an expert witness. So in some states in the United States, being poor actually gives you a better chance to a lawyer. In other states in the United States, however, being poor means that you're going to get a very overworked lawyer who doesn't have the time and ability to spend on your case. So unquestionably, poverty matters. And it matters because of your access to a lawyer and access to investigative and expert services that are the services that a lawyer needs to really be able to make a difference for you. So yes, poverty does matter, but it's more nuanced and a little, it also depends on where you are in the United States, because in some states you are actually better off the poorer you are than if you're the working poor or if you're lower middle class. Then you're really in bad shape, okay? The other comment that I'd make, and I think even in the United States, as rich of a country we are, if we're going to fix a lot of issues in the criminal justice system, we need to spend more money collecting forensic evidence. You know, on CSI and these television shows, you see how all these expert police officers go out and they gather all this forensic evidence and they take it to the crime lab and they solve all the crimes this way. There's no question that if we collect evidence well and it's tested appropriately and we're using good scientific principles, then we don't have to rely so much on eyewitness identification testimony, and we have better forensic evidence that's going to help us solve crimes and help us not only convict the guilty, but free the innocent. And in a country like South Africa, the police force just doesn't have the resources to be able to go out and collect all of the forensic evidence, store it properly, test it properly. They can do it in a handful of cases, like Oscar Pistorius, but in the average case, they're not going to be able to go out. They can't do it in the United States. We don't have the resources. I know in South Africa, they don't have the resources. That's why as I said, in the United States, in less than 10% of the cases do we even have DNA evidence. And that's sad, because if we had more DNA, we wouldn't have to rely on eyewitness identification testimony as much.
Thank you very much, Professor Uphoff. There is, in a way, the elephant in the room is what I'm going to mention to you now. It's from Ateni, a very insightful presentation. It will be elucidating, I believe, to see the false conviction statistics stratified by race of the defendant. And let me add here, Professor Uphoff, I'm sure you probably know the Netflix documentary 13. The 13th, it's about the 13th Amendment. I use it for my class on international protection of human rights law. And of course, the interesting thing that it actually shows is things like, of course, how the war on drug actually increased conviction rates, including wrongful conviction rates, how it actually targets the Black community, how, depending on whether you're into cocaine as compared to weed, how it would potentially affect. And of course, 3 strike and out, how it also contributes. So race plays a very critical role. And related to race is poverty, particularly currently here in South Africa, but in a number of other African countries, where the conversations about poverty and even drug convictions. So if you can build on that, it would absolutely be excellent.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's both race and class. And oftentimes race and class for many defendants is the same thing. You're Black and you're poor. But if you're white and poor, you're going to oftentimes suffer the same adverse consequences as being Black and poor, but not always. And clearly, you're right. For example, there are plenty of studies that show how the death penalty is handed out in the United States. And clearly, if you're poor white, you're less likely to get the death penalty than if you're Black. So both race and class matter in how justice is dispensed in the United States. But there's no question that in a number of different areas, race matters a lot. We know a lot about things like racial profiling. So we know that the police have a tendency to arrest people of color or stop their cars more often than they stop cars of white people. And if it doesn't really matter there, because you can be a Black professional driving a nice car and you'll get stopped more often than a white professional driving a nice car. So yes, race matters. And even though in a number of jurisdictions, people are trying to take steps to address those, we certainly have not resolved that issue anywhere in the United States. It's still an issue in the criminal justice system.
Thank you very much. Another one, I'm aware of the time. In your view, could the jury system play a role in exacerbating wrongful convictions? Example, juries being influenced by irrelevant factors into convicting? Or is this also—
All right, no, that's a really important question. And I'm going to answer it in this way. And this is because I get asked this every year when I come to teach my criminal justice class in the United States or in South Africa. I actually think that the jury system is one of the strengths of the American criminal justice system. And what I say is, I know some really good judges. For example, Albie Sachs. And if I was, as a criminal defense lawyer, I was going to have my trial in front of Albie Sachs, I would be very satisfied and very happy having him make the decision, maybe even over the collective wisdom of 12 ordinary citizens. But I know in the United States, and I believe this is the case around the world, and all that I've read about judges around the world, not all the judges are like Albie Sachs. There are judges who are not very bright. There are judges who are corrupt. There are judges who are lazy. There are judges who are very biased and unfair. And if I have a trial in front of one of those judges, I would always want the collective wisdom of 12 jurors over a bad judge. So are there more good judges or bad judges? Well, that's an interesting empirical question that I think varies from jurisdiction and country to country. I was in front of a lot of good judges, but I was in front of a lot of bad judges as well. But there's a lot of judges in the middle. They have their good days and bad days. They have some biases. And in my view, I think the collective wisdom of 12 ordinary citizens is better than the wisdom of one individual judge. So I actually believe the jury system helps, and I could tell you personal examples of cases where I think if I would have been in front of a judge, my client would have been found guilty, but the jury came back and found my defendant not guilty, and I think that was the just result. So yes, there are problems with some jurors, there are problems with some juries, but I think there are as many, if not more, problems with some judges. So I'm a believer that the American criminal justice system, jury system, is actually one of the strengths. And in the 375 cases, not only did the jury find the person guilty, but all of those cases were reviewed by multiple levels of judges who all reviewed the evidence, and they all found the people guilty. And Jennifer Thompson is a perfect example. Don't care if it was a judge or a jury, they still would have found Ronald Cotton guilty because eyewitness testimony, if it's wrong, is going to fool a judge just like it fools juries.
Thank you very much, Professor Uphoff. That's very useful. The others are comments, but I'm just going to share them. Benedict, he's a PhD student at the University of Pretoria. In Kenya, plea bargaining was there in law, but for a long time it was never actualized. It activated sometimes back, but from the presentation, I can see the injustices that it may enable if it is not applied carefully or correctly. Umesh, of course, our colleague, saying very interesting presentation. Thank you. So Busiso is saying what a great lecture. It's really got me thinking about South Africa. Professor Sam Rujeje saying, thank you, Prof. Uphoff, for an excellent and insightful presentation. Ntombi saying that she's reminded about the Linda Mieni case, which you'd be aware of. Tsawe is saying, also a student from UWC, we also experienced the same challenge in South Africa. I work at legal aid as a candidate attorney, and I remember an occasion when the prosecutor asked me to convince my client to plead guilty because there is overwhelming evidence against him. When I refused and insisted on a trial, the case was withdrawn against my client due to merits. It's really sad to see the state focusing more on stats rather than justice. I mean, a number of prosecutors, they say my conviction rate is so much and so forth. So and Emmanuel is saying, thank you about the eyewitness protection program. And Ateni is saying, to the extent that the law serves as an instrument of societally arbitrated prejudicial procedure, more so than justice, data stratified by prejudicial factors is or would be immeasurably valuable. Example, race in the US, socioeconomic status in sub-Saharan Africa. Much appreciation to you. Diane is saying, thank you very much. This was insightful. And Francine is saying, sorry, I have to leave, but saying thank you also for the Rugema family. And finally, Temba, absolutely. We are intersectional type of lawyering that will take into account class, race, gender, sexual orientation, and other markers of exclusion. So these are just the remarks. Final remarks from you, and then I will add and do the closing.
Well, I thank you for those remarks. I very much enjoyed speaking today on this topic. I teach a course on this, or I have taught a course on this for many years. And I've only scratched the surface in what I would like to share with you. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to email me and I'll be happy to engage in a conversation or respond to your questions. And I will send my slides if anyone wants my slides. And Ben, you can share them with anyone who's interested.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. When you started your presentation, Professor Uphoff, you said that the topic is very much at the heart of justice, at the heart of discrimination, exclusion, and so forth. And these are definitely topics that resonate very well with Ivan. And I couldn't agree more. And I'm just going to make a brief remark from my side. There was the point that his father, Mr. Michael, mentioned earlier, that he spoke for the voiceless. And I've experienced it, and many of us have experienced that. He was an Africanist at heart. Most of the conversations that I've had with him, partly about soccer, but a significant number of them are actually about the African Union, what the African Union should do, what the steps that leadership is taking, if it is taking us forward or backward. He also spoke quite a lot about science and so on. Now, the best proof for this, and it reinforces your point earlier, is to once again, as I did last year, to go back to his tweets. And I'm just going to highlight a few. The last one that he retweeted from someone named Makula says, "The ideal man bears the abstinence of life with dignity and grace, making the best of circumstances." And it's a quote from Aristotle. The other one that he mentioned is about who will succeed China. It's an article about among likely successors and so forth. The other one, speaking about the voiceless, he retweeted an article from BBC, and the title is "Switzerland's Muslims, World Cup Heroes Reignite Immigration Debates." And this is something that he's definitely highlighted every now and then. He of course, we're talking about here about poverty and leadership and why Africa needs leadership and so forth. He retweeted another one, Uruguay president holding meeting with his ministers, why he's the world's poorest leader. And it's a very interesting article, and I encourage everybody to go and read it. And the last one, of course, none other than the Holy Father, Pope Francis. And here it says, "Our mission as Christians is to conform ourselves ever more to Jesus as the model of our lives." It very much resonates with the keywords about being humble, being inspirational, being helpful, assisting, committed to students, leadership, Africanization, and so forth. Those things that we mentioned earlier, that quite a number of things that he tweeted resonate exceptionally well. But of course, I come back to his profile, which says, and I'm repeating it again, Rwanda and global citizen, educator and eternal student. I stand on the shoulders of giants so that I can see more than they. And it's not by accident that the title from the message was about keep walking, something that definitely Ivan embodied, that he lived by, and he actually left us that legacy. So thank you very much, Professor Uphoff, for doing the lecture. I'm going to do the thank yous and appreciation. So we really appreciate that from your busy schedule, you allocated time, prepared the slides, you responded to emails. And when I had this discussion with the family through Moses, when the family proposed that you speak, it was in a blip that you actually accepted, and we set the dates, the time, and here we are. So we really, really appreciate that positive gesture, and I really mean it in every sense of the word when I said it was the easiest to actually organize, and I did 90% of it with colleagues' support through WhatsApp. I definitely want to thank the Rugema family, everybody in the family, for the message, for allowing us to share those moments with your valuable son, brother, uncle, Ivan. We really appreciate it, and thank you very much for being a partner in doing this. I also want to thank Diane Giza from Stellenbosch. She's been very instrumental in this, but also spreading the word and sharing information and so forth. We really appreciate it. I definitely want to thank the speakers, all the speakers who shared, Camila as a former tutor, of course, Hakim, Ms. Salati as well. So we really appreciate what has been provided. I definitely would be remiss if I also don't thank Professor Jose France. She took time from her busy schedule. She had to leave us early because she has other commitments, but we really appreciate her commitment. When I shared this invite with the WhatsApp group that we have with deputy deans, she was the first one who actually responded and said, "I have diarized, I plan to join." And I kindly asked her, Professor Uphoff is a good friend of UWC. You've honored him last year, so please, it would be excellent if you can also introduce him. I also want to say thank you very much to Professor Sambru JJ. He did the inaugural one, but he's been able to find time from his busy schedule to join us today. I want to thank my colleagues, the Dean, Professor Jacques Deville, but also Mhlahla has been very kind in organizing, putting the information out there on the platform and so forth. So thank you everyone for the participation, for all the questions, for all the comments, and we look forward to having another engagement and continue to honor our good friend, our colleague, son, uncle, brother, Ivan Rugema. And until then, have a lovely evening. Once again, thank you very much.